Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm Crosby Kemper. I'm the director of the Kansas City Public Library, the friend of the Urban League, and Gwen Grant, who I will introduce in 1 second. I do want to mention a couple of upcoming programs. Not in our calendar. We have a program tomorrow night with the Goethe Institute, which is the German government's outreach effort around the world, and they're doing pop-up in Kansas City. It's on Main Street, about 20th and Main, and they're taking this lecture around the country. Frido Mann, who is the grandson of the great German novelist Thomas Mann, is giving a lecture on basically the democracy and its salvation, if possible. And he's giving this around the country and giving it tomorrow night at the Kansas City Public Library. I think it's downtown. Carrie went away. It's downtown. It's here? Okay, somebody's actually reading the calendar? Yeah. Okay, thank you. It's here at the Plaza Library. And then in October, we have some great programs coming. We're doing the 100th anniversary of Guadalupe Center on next Wednesday, October 2nd. I'll be interviewing Chris Medina, the director of the Guadalupe Center. We'll be talking not only obviously about the 100-year history of Guadalupe, which is pretty extraordinary, but also about the current state of the Hispanic community in Kansas City and the future of the Hispanic community. And that, I think, is important. I also want to mention, because he's my good friend, as Gwen is, and he's back for his 5th time in the Kansas City Public Library, on October 14th, David Thompson, who I think is the greatest film critic in America, is coming in from San Francisco. And we'll be talking about his latest book, which is called Sleeping with Strangers. It's about sex and desire in Hollywood. We're calling it Screening Desire, so making sure that it's a family program. Not. And last but not least, because it is about what we're talking about tonight in a very specific way, at the end of the month, on October 29th, we have an ongoing series we call What Makes a Great City. And we're doing a lot of things around that. We've done a series on eviction, which helped make eviction an issue in the last mayoral campaign. We're talking about affordable housing in the library. We're talking about a lot of different things, but one of the things that we've concentrated on is what we call strong towns, which is smart growth at a small scale level. And Chuck Marone and Joe Minicozzi, who are leaders in this movement nationally, have been here, and they'll both be here with David Warm of the Mid-America Regional Council, talking about a study that we got the Hall Family Foundation to pay for. That it doesn't sound sexy, but it's really sexy from what we're talking about tonight and what we'll be talking about going forward in the public library: land use in Kansas City. And land use is really about what the city does structurally to support our citizens in various ways. So come and hear that, because I think it's very important, and you'll be hearing a lot of things about the mistakes that Kansas City has made. But tonight I want to, before I introduce, or as an introduction to Gwen, I want to remind you of a moment a few short years ago, when the chair of the Kansas City Chamber of Commerce was African American, the CEO of the United Way was African American, the police chief of Kansas City was African American, the mayor was African American, the superintendent of schools was African American, the CEO of Truman Medical Center was African American, the chancellor of UMKC was African American, the head of one of our largest law firms, upstairs in fact, was African American, our congressman was African American. A little bit smaller point of view, the 3 of the 6 senior managers of the Kansas City Public Library were African American, and you might remember the President of the United States was African American, and Kansas City was majority white. Things have fallen apart since then. That was a joke, by the way. That line was a joke, okay? But what I'm really making a point about is that no one really noticed this. I noticed it when we were thinking about doing a program at the library, and nobody was terribly interested in doing that. But all these things happened, and Kansas City was essentially run by African Americans. But we didn't think about it, we didn't talk about it, we didn't read about it. In fact, we didn't read in the latest mayoral election about the fact that Quentin Lucas Quentin Lucas's election meant that 3 of our last 5 mayors in this majority white city are African American. 2 of our last 3 congressmen in our majority white 5th district are African American in our majority white city, and nobody's talking about it. So we've reached the racial millennium because no one cares about race anymore in Kansas City, right? Thank you for that. You got that joke anyway. Okay. Of course not, though it is interesting and something I think you shouldn't forget about. Maybe the glass ceiling has been dented, but what happens when African Americans run this city? Nothing different than what happened before would be my point. We have one of the highest crime rates in the nation, and we have the highest rate in the United States of black victims of crime. That's been true something like 5 of the last 7 years. The vast majority of victims of violent crime are black. Nearly all the truly innocent victims, the 3-year-olds, the people walking by, the person killed in a crowd, are black in this community. Our education system, where there is some progress, is still a mess. Not just Kansas City public schools, but the inner ring suburbs, even Park Hill, Blue Valley. Almost every school district in the Kansas City metro area, both sides of the state line, all our districts perform below their demographic norms compared to schools around the country. Gwen will give you statistic upon statistic about what's going on in this community, and it will reflect what I'm saying. I want to make one point about the structure of our taxes, something we can do something about. We can do something about it at the ballot box. We can do something about it at city council meetings, at meetings of the Civic Council and the Chamber. We have one of the highest taxed cities in the United States. We have just about the most regressively taxed city in the United States, with the working poor in particular taking the hit. The earnings flat tax from $1. The assistant manager at McDonald's has a much higher percentage of his or her income taken than the lawyers upstairs, for instance. The sales tax, which is a regressive tax. We have very high sales taxes, particularly if you live in the inner city. If you live anywhere near the streetcar, you've got really high sales taxes. The property tax, which is the most progressive of local taxes, it's designed to be progressive. 50% of it's supposed to be on commercial property, is in fact in Kansas City, because very little of it is on commercial property, not a progressive tax. Almost all of you as individuals are paying, and after the current assessment, you're paying a very high tax. Most of the property surrounding us, immediately surrounding us, including this building, is not taxed. It's called tax abatement or tax increment financing. It's unequal, and it's particularly unequal for the poorest people in this community. And finally, our sewer and water rates are close to the highest in the United States. Atlanta's pretty close, and there are places in California where they don't have access to water that they're very high. But compared to any city in the Midwest, highest sewer and water rates. So tax incentives are a part of this. It's reverse Robin Hood. We take from the average Kansas City taxpayer that makes $48,000 a year, and we give money to the wealthiest people in the community. Gwen and I have been fighting this for years. The Urban League and the Kansas City Public Library are united in this. We've broached the glass ceiling, but even having broached the glass ceiling, the leadership of this community, whether black or white, it tells you something about what happens when people get into leadership positions in this community, something called Kansas City nice. We don't want to criticize each other. So even though we have this incredibly disparate system, and we can do something about that, there's some things that are very hard to work on. But the thing we can do something about, City Council could do it tomorrow, is we could change the tax system so that it's fairer. And so I would urge you, and the assessment system, which is part of the problem as well. So I would urge you to listen to us about that over time. But tonight, you're going to hear more about the inequities in this community, some of which are caused by what I've just told you, from Gwen Grant. And Gwen Grant knows about this and has been doing things about this for 25 years, almost 25 years, that she has been leading the Urban League of Kansas City. That's an extraordinary tenure, particularly since she's been in the face of a lot of the leadership that I've been talking about. And she and I are two of the people in this community who know that Kansas City nice just doesn't change things. And I admire her for that. She was, by the way, only 16 years old when she became the leader of the Urban League. She recently has won some major awards and taken some major positions. The governor of the great state of Missouri has put her on the board of higher education for the state of Missouri, and that's a good sign for higher education in Missouri. And she recently won the KCATA's award, the Rosa Parks Award. Now, can you think of a more important award for the bus company to give out than the Rosa Parks Award? And they gave it to my friend, the leader of the Urban League of Kansas City, Gwen Grant.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Crosby, for that really wonderful introduction and certainly setting the tone for a very important discussion this evening. I am delighted to have this opportunity to partner yet again with the Greater Kansas City Public Library to present the Urban League State of Black Kansas City Equality Index report. And I just need to take a few minutes to acknowledge people and organizations that help to make this endeavor possible. So I'd like to start out by again thanking Crosby and Carrie and all the members of the KC Public Library team for graciously hosting us and taking good care of us as we present this program this evening. I'd like to acknowledge also the two organizations that made the research and publication of this book possible, and they are School Smart KC and Awas Sufi, please stand, President and CEO of School Smart KC, and Denise, I see Denise is written here. Denise St. Omer, Senior VP with the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation. Without these investments, we would not be able to conduct this research and provide this very important information, so we sincerely appreciate your support. We also want to acknowledge our editorial advisory committee members who are here tonight. Would you guys all please stand? In the interest of time, I'm not going to name everyone, but we have our editorial advisory committee. And we also have some of our contributing authors here this evening. Would you please stand? I was going to read their names, but Crosby got up here and took up all my time. So you all get on Crosby for that. I was going to name you individually, talk about your titles and how great you are. Crosby ate up all that time, so that won't happen tonight. But I think you're great. I love you, and thank you so much for your contributions. We also, I do want to acknowledge our my editorial assistant on this project, who I probably totally ran crazy, Julie Tenenbaum, and the graphic designer, Carrie Maidment, the young lady who designed our book, and she's a phenomenal graphic artist. Okay, so I just want to give you an overview of this I just want to give you an overview of the process and talk a little bit about why we do the State of Black Kansas City. Why do we gather this data? Why do we publish this report? So starting in 2005, when Mark Morial became president and CEO of the National Urban League, he had the vision or the insight to say, you know, the Urban League as a civil rights and human services organization has been working on this road to equality for, at that time, nearly 90 years when he first came on board. But we need to begin to be able to talk more definitively about how much progress we've made on this journey towards equity. And so he worked with an organization, a research organization called Global Insights, and they developed the research methodology so that we can begin to publish what we call the State of Black America Equality Index, to measure how much progress African Americans have made in comparison to whites in the areas of education, economics, health, social justice, and civic engagement. And so we joined in that research in 2006, locally conducting the study in collaboration with UMKC, and I do want to acknowledge that they are responsible for doing the research, gathering the empirical data. We do not do that at the Urban League, so they take full responsibility for the efficacy of the numbers and for the research. So for this particular report, UMKC Institute for Human Development, in partnership with UMKC Center for Economic Information, conducted the research and the findings that I will share with you this evening. So moving right along, I'm going to go ahead and get into sharing the findings from the research. Following that, we will have a panel discussion, and I'll introduce 3 of the talented women. This is a night for women, just so you guys know. Talented, powerful women will be on stage tonight, sharing 3 of the authors, and we'll be talking about urban education, still separate and unequal. So let's get through this. I have to speed up. So just to give you an overview of the Equality Index and the components of the index, as I stated before, we measure our progress in health, education, economics, social justice, and civic engagement. And so as you can see, the pie chart gives you the breakdown of how, and the methodology and how those various areas are weighted. So with economics having a value of 30%, and education and health each having 25% weight, social justice and civic engagement each having 10% to get the 100% weighting for the study. So when we look at this, and I'm not going to read all of these sub-indicators, but you can see here that under health there are several sub-indicators that are measured, and it shows exactly how they are weighted in the methodology. The same holds true for education. Because this book focuses primarily on urban education issues, we will spend more time this evening talking about education. So I will point out that the education sub-indicators include education quality, attainment, scores, enrollment, and student status and risk factors. The other area, though, that is also critically important, and as we have conducted this research since 2006, we can see from a longitudinal perspective just how much progress we've made, but it's also really sad to see how little progress we've made. It's, so when you, especially in the area of economics, and when you see the overall index, which I will show you now, you can see that the Black-White Equality Index for 2019 is, and for education is 76.7. And so let me just back up and explain that the index is basically a comparison of blacks to whites, with one being whole, whites being the control group. And so how do we compare in that context? So basically, in the area of education, we are only 76.77% of having a full, the whole one. Okay? And then in economics, this is the area of concern, 60.67%. Health, 74.86%. Social justice, 54.96%. Civic engagement is where we exceed whites with the value of 108.59%, with our total overall equality index for 2019 for blacks in Kansas City at 72.5%. We also added last year, the last time we published this report was in 2015, we started to include a Hispanic white index. And so, as you can see, at the total equality index of 77.23%, Hispanics are doing slightly better than African Americans in the Kansas City area, as well as you'll see when I do the national comparison, as well as across the country. But as far as education, Hispanics have achieved 69.45%, economics 64%, health 103.73%. Hispanics are healthier than blacks and whites in Kansas City and across the country. Social justice 74.66%, civic engagement 72.72%, and with the overall total quality index of 77.23%. This slide shows a comparison of the local index for Kansas City to the National Urban League Index. And the national data, though, is for 2018, which is the last time the National Urban League did the Equality Index. They did not do an index in 2019. They are skipping until we can complete the 2020 census. As we will not do an index next year, we'll wait until the conclusion of the 2020 census, and we'll do another one. So you can see for Kansas City and the nation, African Americans are at the same 72.5%, and for Hispanics, nationally 79.3 and locally 77.2. Now let's take a look at the education index. So what we study in terms of the key education variables is we look at classes taught by highly qualified teachers, high school graduation rates, ACT composite scores, and bachelor's degree completion. What we see is that only 38% of classes, African American students, benefit from classes taught by highly qualified teachers. And for high school graduation rates, we see that blacks do graduate at higher rates than whites, yet our persistence through college graduation is significantly less than our white counterparts at 20% compared to 42%. And then the very troubling ACT test scores, which really provides evidence of the black-white achievement gap. You see that black students average, the ACT composite score is 14.4 compared to 22.8 for white students. And as we take a look at Hispanics, with classes taught by highly qualified teachers, 62% for Hispanic students compared to 97.8% for non-Hispanic white students. With regard to high school graduation rates, Hispanics also graduate from high school at a higher rate than their non-Hispanic white counterparts. And with ACT composite scores, Hispanics 14.8 average, and non-Hispanic whites 22.8. Same for bachelor's degree completion rates. We do not persist through graduation with a 4-year degree, both blacks and whites. So now let's take a look at the student status and risk factors. These are those issues that show up in classrooms across the greater Kansas City area, and these contribute to the disparities. And some of these really are indicative of the economic conditions in which these children live. Black children in the greater Kansas City area are 2 to 3 times more likely than white children to live in poverty and live in a home with no parent in the labor force. 99.8% of black students in Jackson County are eligible for free or reduced price lunches compared to 20% of white students. And in Wyandotte County, that figure is 84.6% of black students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunches compared to 50% of white students. In Jackson County, black children are 7 times more likely than white students to be suspended from school for 10 or more days. And in Wyandotte County, black students are 3.4 times more likely than white students to be suspended from school. The discipline issues are critical. Go back here. So when we look at those school discipline issues, and we'll have some conversation about that later with our panelists, these factors also contribute to these persistent inequities in education, in urban education, and it points to why urban education is still separate and still unequal. One new feature for this publication is that we, with the advice of our editorial advisory committee, added a series of recommendations after each of these sections of this book. So when you get your copy as you leave this evening, I encourage you to read the recommendation. I encourage you to read the whole book. If you don't read it, you need to give it back. No, just kidding. If you're not going to read it. But we want you to read the book, but pay particular attention to the recommendations. We thought we would, and as I think Crosby mentioned to you, that we've been working on economic issues and education issues since I've been president of the Urban League and before that, especially in education, and especially as it relates to social justice and economic inclusion. So we decided that we would share our recommendations with the hope that each of you will take what you can and learn from this, and then take action, do what you can within your circle of influence. So one of the recommendations we bring forward relative to the out-of-school and in-school disciplinary issues, because if kids aren't in school, then obviously their academic performance is not going to be up to par. And so we need to keep them in school, and we need to hold school systems, charter schools, public schools, all education systems accountable for doing everything that they can to do that. So what we're recommending is that the Missouri and Kansas Departments of Elementary and Secondary Education require that discipline data reporting requirements be expanded to include demerit systems and buddy room systems data, so that we can have, and that data should be collected, should be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, ability, and national origin. Then we can begin to track why these kids are out of school, and maybe provide some supports to those schools to help teachers to learn how to better manage classroom environments and how to address their cultural incompetencies. All school districts and charter schools should establish school discipline advisory councils to review all codes of conduct, handbooks, and discipline practices through an equity lens, and provide feedback, input, and recommendations to ensure that policies that have inequitable impact are addressed. We also want to encourage the Missouri and Kansas Departments of Elementary and Secondary Education to mandate that all school districts and charter schools design and institutionalize culturally relevant pedagogical frameworks into every aspect of the teaching and learning process. Additionally, we recommend that all teachers and administrators be required to complete culturally relevant pedagogical professional development programs. This is a critical factor in helping to address school discipline issues and to decrease the disparities in suspension rates and in-school and out-of-school suspension for African American students, especially our little black boys. To address fragmentation and foster the economies of scale relative to the urban education landscape, we believe that the number of charter sponsors needs to be reduced from 4 to 2. And we'll let you guys figure out how to do that, but that's the recommendation. We know that's politically volatile, but it needs to be done. The Urban League recommends that the Kansas City Public Schools pilot a site-based leadership model, similar in design to the Empower Schools Empowerment Zones model. And Empowerment Zones are a school's partnership with the district that sustainably provides a cohort or zone schools with wide autonomy and strong accountability under innovative governance structures. Now, we support this because for years the Urban League has done a lot of research on how quality schools work across the country, and what are the factors that contribute to those schools where schools in urban areas that are in distressed communities with high poverty rates, yet they are exceeding suburban schools in their educational outcomes. And one of the critical factors in that equation was site-based leadership. And so we strongly recommend that the Kansas City Public Schools pursue this, do a pilot, see if we can make it work here. And it will also, I believe, position them with a whole lot more competitive advantage on this competitive education landscape in which they reside at this time, because they're competing with this high number of charter schools. And if you, under district leadership, have site-based leadership models, I think the outcomes will demonstrate that it's a good direction. So now we're going to move on and talk about economics. So one of the troubling things for me when I look at these data is that we often hear people talk about education as the great equalizer and how important it is to get an education. And if you have an education, then you're going to be able to be economically self-sufficient. Yet when we look at our economic numbers, we find that we have not made nearly the amount of progress that we've in economics as we have in education. So when you look at the median household income for blacks compared to whites, with black median household income at 37.9, $38,000 a year compared to $70,000 a year for whites, and you look at that median net worth of households, this is just, every time I see this, it just makes me sick. It's because this is 2019. And we started tracking this, and we said that our starting line would be from the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So if that's when we started this race, still, Our median net worth is just slightly less than 10% of white median net worth. So with all of our economic self-sufficiency, we still have not achieved economic parity. So then when you look at the poverty rate of 24.96% for blacks compared to 7.97% for whites. And then home ownership rates. Only 42.66% of blacks in Kansas City own their homes compared to 76% for whites. And home ownership is a critical factor in economic stability. It's a critical factor in creating wealth. It's a critical factor in having equity to be able to get a loan to start a business. We have been locked out of the economic framework. And when my buddy Crosby was up here talking about how so many African Americans hold positions of leadership, yet we don't see equity in the outcomes that matter. And that's because of the structural impediments. And we really, to address that, we have to begin to look at policies differently. We have to change our practices, and we have to approach this from using a systemic process, recognizing that we have to undo all of those intentional barriers and structures that were put in place to deny us access to the economic opportunities in this country and in this city. And until we change policies, until we change practices, these data will continue to be the same, or we will just creep along and with nothing but frustration. So this, economics and education, two of the most important things that we need to be working on if we want to see some different outcomes going forward. And you can see that for median household income for Hispanics, median household income for Hispanics in the greater Kansas City area is a little bit higher than it is for blacks at $44,405. And the median net worth is much lower, troubling, $12,239. Compared to 171,000 for whites. We've got a problem. So the poverty rate for Hispanics is lower at 23.02% compared to, lower than blacks in the area, but compared to whites at 7.9%. More Hispanics in the area own their homes at 53.12% than blacks, but still compared to whites, much more progress needs to be made. So we have, and the slides are full, we wanted to just show you that we have the recommendations, so you have to read the book. I don't like to have slides with a lot of words on them because it makes it difficult, but I just want to hit on a few of these things because these are some really important recommendations, and we want to start with to quicken our pace and towards economic equality. Our banks and credit unions really need to work with the Urban League and other organizations, community-based organizations, to create more pathways to home ownership for low and moderate income individuals. So we know that there are programs out there, but obviously if we look at these numbers, there aren't enough. So we've got to do more to create more opportunities for people of color to own their own homes. And then if we're going to have opportunities for them to own their own homes, then we've got to address the lack of quality affordable housing. It's a major problem in the area, and we need to approach it differently than it's been approached before, and therefore we recommend that the City Council apply an equity-based approach in the design of housing policies that defines affordability based on median household income in distressed communities where the median household income is significantly less than the citywide median household income. So when they're looking at these numbers and they're trying to work on these affordable housing issues, then you have folks come in and they talk about the whole metropolitan service area and what the median household income is there. But that, if we just do it that way, the same old way we've always been doing it, we're going to continue to get the same outcomes. So we've got to look at it differently. And then we have to address, as my colleague Crosby will probably come out and do a little dance when I say these things, the overuse of tax abatements for wealthy developers to the detriment of local taxing jurisdictions is a problem. And it was really quite concerning for me as I read the article about the KC Public Schools deciding not to lower their levy, the assessment, as it relates to the assessment issue with Jackson County, and everybody wants to get up in arms about them not lowering their levy when we have not been able to raise a levy for Kansas City Public Schools in more than 50 years. I mean, seriously, people? Okay, I just don't understand that. So, get over it, suck it up, and pay the increases, because the school system needs the money to provide a quality education system, and these properties have been undervalued for more than 20 years. At some point, it has to catch up. And we shouldn't try to have it catch up on the backs of our children's education. So we have to figure out other ways to get that done. But what we urge the city the city council to pass a comprehensive tax incentive reform ordinance, and we have several recommendations. I'm not going to go into them today. I do want to let you know that there are individuals, including myself, the representatives from the chamber, the Civic Council, and other organizations, community-based organizations, working collaboratively to address tax incentive reform and to collaborate and hopefully make some recommendations to the City Council in this respect. But I will tell you that we are going to be pushing. I'm on that committee, and I'm going to be pushing that this reform ordinance allows school districts to opt in or out of abatement projects going forward. And then I'm going to follow our new mayor's recommendations. I listed them all here, so he should have known. I was taking notes. He was making promises, and I was writing them down. So I have like several things on this list that our new mayor said that he would do relative to economic tax reform, tax incentive reform, such as reducing the time span of abatements from 25 to 10 years, and then exclusive of housing projects, exclusive of affordable housing projects to gradually drive down the 75% cap on abatements, curtail incentives except in continuously distressed areas, restrict blight to severely distressed census tracts, and then provide no debt guarantees for economic development in vibrant areas, such as like putting a new office building downtown, for instance, and require upfront negotiation with taxing jurisdictions before these projects are approved. And then the other one that's important here, as far as the recommendation goes, and I'm not going to read all that, it's a lot, is that they really redefine blight. Because right now, the way it works, you can define blight. It's so vague, it's so broad, and some of these things, okay, I'll have to go on, you got it. Okay, great. So we're going to recommend that they follow, you have a more specific definition of blight, and we provide some recommendations for what that means. And then finally, to address, well, I think I have two more, not finally, I got another real important one. So, but to address the issue of the absence or the lack of access to capital for MBE firms, we want to encourage the local lending institutions to follow the lead of my board member and colleague sitting over here, Joshua Rowland of Lead Bank. And they have a civic contractor funding program to extend credit to minority business enterprises and disadvantaged business enterprises. More banks need to do that. So you all need to be talking to Josh and figuring out how to get money into the hands of minority enterprises. And so I'm going to go to this next one because my friend Robbie's going to like this one. So, and I didn't introduce him earlier, Robbie Mackinnon, CEO of KCATA, is here. So please salute Robbie because he is a trailblazer. He is taking names and the rest at KCATA and really doing a phenomenal job of bringing equity into public transportation. So we support his endeavor to to get an ordinance passed so that we can have free transit in Kansas City. And so if you agree with that, say amen. Let the church say amen. And so this recommendation pretty much outlines all the rationale behind that. I'm not going to go into all of that because I would not do Robbie justice. Nobody can do it better than he can. But what I will say to you is that what we're recommending, our one specific recommendation in this area, is that the City Council instruct the City Manager to restore to KCATA the $2 million in transportation tax revenue that is currently being diverted from KCATA to fund free rides on the KC streetcar. Yeah. Okay? That's the simple thing. They get that $2 million back, and then they just need to find $4 million. And it's not hard to find that in that size of that budget. It's just not. We just have to say that they need, hold them accountable to doing that. So I'm going to really run through this because I got to get to a point so we can have I got to see where I am with time. Ooh, I'm already over time. Okay, so the health, I'm going to do like, bam, there's health. See that? There are lots of disparities, and we got to work on them. The overall health index was 75%. I'm not going to get into the details on that. Here's the number. Hispanics are overall health, 104%, doing better than everybody else in health, and primarily due to how well they do with reproduction, pregnancy, and life expectancy. And then we have other variables in health that I'm going to skip. We are supportive of Medicaid expansion. I'm sorry? I know, I'm on a tight time frame, I promise you. So it's in the book. I'm going to say what we support, and that is we support Medicaid expansion. Okay? And just so you know, the last publication, our focus was on urban health issues. So with the 2015-2016 edition, the focus was on urban health. So I apologize for having to refresh, but I've got some panelists we need to hear from, and I'm blaming Crosby. He took up more time at the front. Just get Crosby, okay? And so, but we do recommend, we do support Medicaid expansion, and we think that there needs to be more effort, that combined effort across state lines, and asking our civic leaders and corporations to help, use their lobbyists to help push at the state levels to try to help us get this Medicaid expansion done. It's very important to address access to health for Blacks and Hispanics in the area, and poor people. It's important. The other thing that I can't get into deeply, but is to talk about the violence in Kansas City. I think Crosby mentioned that. We have the high crime, the high violence, the high murder rate. But we want to make this recommendation in health from a mental health perspective. We believe, as a psychologist who is a contributing essayist in the book, Stefan Staley, talked about research around post-traumatic stress disorder and how that impacts violence and crime in our community. So we are recommending that Health Forward, Reach Healthcare Foundation, and mental health providers collaborate with urban school districts, charter schools, faith and community-based and youth service organizations to provide licensed clinical psychologists and other mental health services for youth, individuals, and families that are suffering from violence-related PTSD. And we think that will have some significant impact if it's in the classroom, so that when it's in that school. When a kid comes to school having been the victim of violence or witnessed violence, that they get that immediate intervention at an earlier age, at an earlier stage in their lives, that can have some importance. So that's where we are there. Social justice, prison sentences, Blacks, we're incarcerated at higher rates, longer sentences. We are the, murder victimization rate for Blacks is 77% compared to 20% for whites. And so, I'm just going to hit these in this recommendation, a couple of them. One is that The 2018 vehicle stops report that the Attorney General publishes every year, and consistently every year the data are either the same or worse, and it's gotten worse. So basically, blacks in Kansas City are 91% more likely than whites to be stopped while driving. And year after year after year, this report is published, and year after year after year, nothing is done about it. They just tell us that's the case, but they do not hold local law enforcement jurisdictions accountable for changing these numbers. So we're recommending that the Missouri legislature amend Senate Bill 1053 to allow the governor to withhold funds to law enforcement agencies that show patterns of racial profiling in their annual vehicle stops reports. And then when we look at those incarceration, I'm sorry? Oh, thank you. And when we look at those incarceration rates, we think the contributing factor is this issue of cash bail. So, because many people end up in the system because they cannot afford to pay cash bail. And we have an essay in the book, read it, it's short and it's powerful, and based on that, we are recommending that Legal Aid Society, ACLU, Missouri and Kansas Bar Associations, other stakeholders, that we get to work here to arrive at some policy so that we can have a way of addressing bail. We need to either have a fund that the poor people can tap into to get their bail so that they do not have to go to jail because they cannot pay bail. And many of them will then plea. They'll take a plea bargain so they don't have to go to jail so that they can keep their job. And then they get caught up in the system. And so we've got to do some things to change the system. With regard to civic engagement, we have our black performance is higher than whites in this area. As you can see, the data from the 2016 election, we voted at higher rates than whites. And I think this is the last data that were available for them. And then Kansas, blacks in Kansas voted at a rate of 61%, and whites at 72%. And Hispanics, there's a lot of work needs to be done on getting Hispanics to show up and vote. And if you read Ellie Moxley's article on KCUR today about representation on school boards and how Latinos are not being elected to serve. We have like one Latino in the Missouri or in Kansas City who's holding office. These things are just totally unacceptable. So here we have a list of recommendations about voting, and what I can say to you is just a couple of things, having participated in the National Urban League annual conference, and these are Urban League recommendations primarily from a national level. But if we have got to get a vote, we've got to mobilize a vote, and we've got to protect the vote in 2020. It's just those two very important things. If you don't remember anything else, remember that. Okay, so if you look at the overall equality indices over time, as I mentioned earlier, we started gathering the data in 2006. And you can see here in 2019, that the overall index for blacks, these numbers are rounded up to 73%. But you can see that our progress has been static if you look at the sub-indicators. And it's really troubling to see the economics indicators, the social justice indicators. I mean, all of them are not good, but economics, education, and social justice, really quite troubling. There's so much more work to be done. So let's get to work, people. So now what we're going to do is move on and get our panel up here. And we're going to try, I'm trying to rush so that you will actually have, no. This is going to be a real short panel. So let me introduce our panelists while they get this set up. We will be hearing from Dr. Kokithia Hill, who is Vice Chair of the Urban League Board of Directors, a strategic advisor to School Smart KC, and a principal with the Stone Hill firm. Come on up, Kokithia. And then Ellie Moxley, who is a journalist with KCUR and is doing a phenomenal job of education reporting there. And Kim Riley. Kim Riley is the founder of the Transition Academy Special Needs College and Career Planning Center. So these are all some highly talented ladies, and thank you. They're going to give me very short answers to these questions so that you all get to ask some questions as well. And these are open-ended questions, so it's going to be hard. So we're going to start with Ellie. So let's begin with just a brief discussion of the local education landscape. And our publication includes a reprint of your in-depth analysis of Kansas City's school system, in which you observe that the school system is more segregated today than it was in the 1990s. So can you please provide briefly highlight the data that substantiates this observation, and why do you believe our school system is more segregated today than in the past?
So this actually came from a system analysis that the Kansas City Public Schools did this spring. They looked at not just their schools, but all the schools in what they consider the education system, which includes our charter schools. And about half of the kids in Kansas City in their attendance area do attend charter schools. And they went back about 20 years before charters entered the market in Kansas City and found at that time about half of the schools in Kansas City met the U.S. Office of Civil Rights' definition of segregated, which is any school that has 75% children of color and, you know, not that proportion of white students as well. And over time, as charters have come into the market, the school system has actually gotten more segregated. We went from having about half of our schools in the city meeting that definition of segregation to nearly 80% of them. We see more white families starting to re-enter the school system, but one of the things that I think is really striking is they tend to favor the same 4 or 5 charter schools, and there is data to back that up. But I think it's really stark, and I think it's something that we really need to be paying attention to.
So just one other thing. Today you posted an article about the composition of school boards. Can you share briefly, quickly, a little bit about that? And then you were primarily focusing this research on school districts, not charter schools.
Right. I looked at 18 of the school districts, Missouri and Kansas, that I consider kind of central to our coverage area here at KCUR. It includes both city school districts, some of the inner ring suburbs, as well as what we think of more of the traditional suburbs, you know, Lee Summit, Blue Valley. And we have a lot of all-white school boards in Kansas City. Among those 18 districts, 8 of them have an all-white school board, and all of our districts are getting more diverse. I think one of the most interesting things that's happening in Kansas City education right now is, you know, we talk a lot about white flight out of Kansas City, and what's actually been occurring over the last decade or so is black flight out of Kansas City. And a lot of that is families that are looking for quality education options for their children. They want to go wherever they can get the best education possible. And I think the challenge is, and we've seen this in some of our suburban districts, that they are entering majority white school systems that are not being as receptive to their needs as children of color that they need to succeed.
Thank you. So do you plan to do the same for charter schools?
I would like
Please.
to do that. I definitely think that there are a lot of equity questions that we need to be asking of all of our school systems. I really like digging into the data on some of these things. But for example, in this school board story, I mean, that was data I had to compile myself, and not everyone was willing to cooperate with me. So that's something that I'd really love to see more investment into, you know, education reporting and things like that, so that more me's can dig into these issues and get what I think there's an absolute appetite and a hunger to find out.
Yeah, well, I certainly think it's important that all, you know, if the school is publicly funded, then it should be publicly governed. And we need to know who's serving on these boards so that we can hold them accountable for the outcomes for our children as well. So we hope that we can get some research on that going forward. So the next question is for Dr. Hill. You have the title essay in the book, Urban Education Still Separate and Unequal. And in that you wrote, "It has been more than 60 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education ruling that separate but equal schools are unconstitutional. And yet, as a nation, we are still addressing policies and discriminatory practices in schools, workplaces, and governmental agencies that routinely produce inequitable outcomes for people of color. Can you unpack that for us? Define what you mean by discriminatory practices and inequitable outcomes.
And you said unpack this in 2 minutes.
No,
right?
in 1 minute.
In 1 minute, okay.
Just kidding.
I think
2 minutes.
from the data that we've seen today, we can understand that across some major systems in our society that they're producing disparate outcomes for African Americans and other people of color. We also, through historical analysis of policies, of programs, of practices, of legislation, we can see that these same systems that are producing these disparate outcomes also have roots that are embedded in structural and institutional racism, right? So we can see that when you have a targeted effort to marginalize, exclude, and to not equip a certain population of folks, that once that fight for equality, which we started from 1930s and 50s and 75 when we talk about students with disabilities, that there's always been this fight to push the educational system to become more equal for women, for African Americans, for English language learners, for LGBTQIA students, for students with disabilities. And while that fight is so important and so needed to more perfect our system of education and other systems, we also realized that it conflated the importance of equity, right? So we get into the systems, and then the system is trying to respond to deal with, acclimate, assess a population of people that it was not structurally designed to welcome and include. And so throughout the time, we've made adjustments to that system. Thank you. We've made adjustments to that system, but now that we are in the system theoretically, right? You can apply for any job, you can go to almost any school, you can decide to go to any college, you can work in any place. Now we're starting to say, okay, if we know that this system for decades excluded, then we also know that it advantaged certain populations of people, right? So how do we give students, if I unpack education, what he or she needs to be successful in this system as it, for lack of better words, tries to right its historical wrongs? And one of the things that I think as we start to talk about equity and using an equity lens is we can't afford to be in silos, right? Like education is spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to solve in-school factors, but not really always talking to or connected or aligned with economic well-being or housing. And we see that segregation in schools follows segregation in housing. We understand that if as an African American, I am less than 10% of the median white income, then what does that mean for me if I'm trying to create a stable family, if I'm trying to send my kid to a high opportunity school, if I'm trying to give them a rich cultural experience, right? So we understand that we have to link these systems. Something else that I'll say before I stop talking is that requires like bold leadership, right?
Yes.
Like that requires us to take some uncomfortable stances, to move from discomfort, and to really talk about what that looks like. And as for education, to model that, because we believe that you have to model what you expect others to do. I will tell you that we collect, measure, assess, discuss, debate, all sorts of data about kid performance. But as our parents talk about, we don't have that same kind of data for teachers. And this is not to talk about teachers, because I've worked in the school system. I know that there are committed, dedicated professionals that are overworked and underpaid. I also know that when you go into school and if you talk to a teacher, if you know one, they can tell you about 5 other teachers that are not cutting the mark. At any given school. Try it, see it for yourself, bring me back the data, we can talk about it. So we have to start saying, if we know that research tells us that one of the single largest indicators of a student being successful is the quality of teachers, and we see that there are disparities, why do we not have information on teacher quality, folks? Like, we gotta start talking about that. And does that mean that we are anti-labor union or anti-teacher unions? It means that if I would take an example out of the Bar Association, I don't know much about lawyers, but what I do know is if I feel like a lawyer has wronged me, if I feel like a lawyer was not ethical, I can complain to an association that will take that complaint and that will investigate it. And if they find that if indeed these charges are substantial, they will go after that license, right? Because they understand that the power of the association is predicated on the quality of the people inside the organization. So all I'm saying is we got to start having these discussions about these data points and all of the factors that are contributing to these disparate outcomes. In 2 minutes. Thank you.
Good job. Good job. Yes. Excellent. Whew, I knew you would be excellent. Both of you, fantastic. Kimberly. So, yeah, so your essay is titled "To Be Young, Gifted, Black, and Disabled" brings into perspective the inequities that plague African American students with disabilities. You refer to this group as the invisible population. So please shed some light on the systemic disparities as they relate to students of color with special needs, and briefly share a few recommendations for mitigating these issues.
Well, first of all, I'm a native Kansas City, born and raised, born to a teenage mom, and born on the east side. And this community rallied behind to make sure that this black girl did not fall through the cracks. Yeah. And so whenever, thank you, whenever I showed any promise, it was, Kim, you're great in communications. Let's make sure that you have this opportunity. Kim, you're great. We're going to send you to this leadership conference. And so getting to that point where I graduate from Lincoln Academy, and there you go. And then go to Mizzou, first generation college student on full Pell. I didn't know I was poor until I got to Mizzou, and I was like the only one of my friends who were on full Pell. The rest of them didn't qualify. But that's how good this community rallied behind me. I never knew I was poor. I knew I was talented, and this community would make sure that I would get to the promised land. Well, fast forward, I have a son with autism, and to see the complete opposite treatment that students with disabilities face. He is literally being pushed to the back of the bus. And I'm going, no, he's coming to the front of the bus with me, doggone it, we're going to drive the bus. And so when we talk about the data and disparities, Gwen and I were working really hard to find data on the differences in our races and ethnic groups, and we couldn't even find the data. So that's just how insignificant this population is. But when you look at the disparities, when you look at the fact that our students are separate but unequal, when you look at the fact that parents in many schools do not have the right to visit their own children's classroom, FERPA, which is supposed to be a privacy law, is being misused. And they're saying that if I have a child who's in the school, or let's say I have my child is headed to kindergarten and I want to visit the classroom, they're saying, no, you're banned from the classroom. Because, yeah, you might see another child who wants to be anonymous. We used to call it passing once upon a time, if you didn't want your race and you could have passed for white. Some people are so ashamed of their disability that they don't want anyone to know that they're disabled, and so they will ban parents from visiting the classroom. I had to fight a battle with the school district and say, absolutely not. I will go to the class whenever I want to, when I need to arrange it with the teacher. And so we have got to demand that school districts stop these policies. You best believe that if the policy said that white parents could visit their white kids in the class and black parents can't visit their black kids in the class, we'd be up in arms. We need to be up in arms and demand that schools stop misusing FERPA, and that if a parent wants their child to remain anonymous, that parent sign, every parent says either yay or nay, and they waive their right. And if your child if you don't want your child identified, that child leave the class, they go to speech therapy or occupational therapy. There are a number of ways that they can leave the classroom so that that students and parents can visit and be able to be engaged and learn how their children learn so that they can model it at home.
Thank you. Thank you. So we could go on and on with each one of these panelists and really go deep into these issues, and unfortunately we don't have time to do that because we do want to allow an opportunity for audience members to ask questions. So I think we can probably do about 10 minutes. There are microphones at here at each aisle, and so we can just, yeah, you're lining up, great. So If you have a question, get in line and we'll try to get through it.
Before I got to my current age, I was in the classroom for 20 years, both here and in Florida. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about is the amazingly large amount of testing that students have to go through, standardized tests. And I'm particularly concerned with the amount of pressure that we put these students under to be successful on these tests, but I don't see very much of a relationship between the test results and the amount of effort that the state and local school boards put into making sure that all of these students, no matter how they performed, receive the kind of services that they need to be successful. And quit comparing these students so that they feel so bad if they're a little bit different. And I wondered if any or all of you could comment on whether you agree with that as a goal, and if so, how would this be implemented more effectively?
Yeah, thank you for your statement and question. I think that with testing and assessment, we have a great deal of information about how students are performing and how schools are performing. So on one hand, we like to see the data that testing provides. We also know that it's a snapshot in a moment that kids are experiencing. And no matter how much practice, there are some folks that just get a lot of anxiety, kids that get a lot of anxiety around taking tests. One of the things that we are seeing in our educational ecosystem is really starting to disrupt that and say, guess what? We want kids to be well-rounded. We want kids to be prepared to be successful, not only in school, but in life. And so that means that we have to adjust the curriculum. We have to think about career. We have to think about what do you need to be a thriving citizen that can actively engage and compete. And so I think you're onto something. Yes, there's a lot of testing and assessment and judging based on those. And I think we need to take a critical look and say, what does a quality school and what does a quality education actually encompass? And it can't be this narrow, single focus on how well you did in April when you took this test for 1 week. So yeah, totally agree with you.
Yes, I'm in my early 60s, and as I was growing up, I got the distinct impression the United States as a whole was on the rise. It was ascending. Now, not so much. And so my question is this. Don't you think it would be a good idea for people who are concerned about equality between different groups of people to take a look at the society as a whole and see how healthy the whole society is? And I would submit, you know, we were going like this when I was young and coming up. We're now at best plateauing and perhaps even declining. And if that's true, and you may think it is, you may think I'm full of baloney, but if the society as a whole is starting to slide down the greasy pole, so to speak, isn't that going to make it's by osmosis the people who are here are going to stay there, and the people up here are going to stay there, but the whole thing is maybe not going in the right direction. And so my point is, should people who are interested in equality also look at the totality of our society and see where the whole thing's going?
I definitely agree that we need to look beyond quantifiable data like testing, and we need to look at the capacity of learning. Education is supposed to equip you so that you can live a healthy, productive life after high school. And what does that mean? And so I think that focusing on making sure that education standards align with career standards, and that we spend as much time focusing on making sure that children are equipped to learn. We know that many of us have changed jobs multiple times. So just teaching children to check a box and to get an answer right on a test, that cannot be the true measure of achievement. We have to make sure that they learn so that they can be contributing members of society, so that they can adapt and they can pivot. So then when technology enters, how do you adapt and how do you succeed in that realm? So those are just my thoughts.
So that was a good response to part of the question. So, we don't have time to really get deep into that question because we could go there and be all night. I heard this at a conference, just a few days ago. I heard someone say that, I can explain it to you, but I can't make you understand. And you need to just reflect on that for a second when I go here. We're talking about an equity issue. What you're talking about is equity. And what you're missing in this thing about, well, if we just look at the overall society, well, the overall society for white people is doing fine. We need to look at the disparities. And so when you address equity, so if you're talking about a race and you hold this up, and this is society here, and we down here, and if we just keep on looking at everything like this, you're right, we're gonna continue to be like this. So what we gotta do is deal with this down here. It's like triage. You go into an emergency room. Yeah. You had a heart attack, and my leg is broke. Who the hell do you think they need to be working on? The heart attack or the broken leg? Right? So we got a heart attack going on over here, and you're talking about putting some casts on broken legs. So let's get to the next question.
I'm your next question. As I elderize, I'm baffled by the continual, constant, repeated inequities. And the question I have for you today is that when we read this report about traumatization, and Kim has even pointed out a little bit about today about the disabled children, I'm wondering if these aren't health problems as opposed to educational problems. And I'm beginning to sort of take on health as really being the denominator issue in all the social determinants of health. Now, would you, before I die, would you sort of at least explain for me kind of how we got to separate disabilities from health care? In other words, I'm just kind of wondering, why are we separating, or why are we addressing these as educational issues when they really have their answer, or at least their history, in health? Just a comment.
So you don't need me to respond or anything? Okay. We'll talk offline though, Jim. We'll talk offline. So we want to get to the next question.
I'm not originally from this area. I'm from the West Coast, and I've been affiliated with the Urban League on the West Coast and in Denver. And in both of those locations, they've had vocational schools specific for IT, because computers are really a place that you can become financially stable. And I was wondering, is that going to happen here with the Urban League, or you guys are going to start doing vocational schools? I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist usually to do IT. So that's my question.
No, we're probably not going to be doing vocational training, particularly in the manner of operating our own vocational school, but we are highly engaged in providing vocational training opportunities for the people we serve here through those organizations and institutions that exist to do that. So one thing to know about urban leagues, we are each urban league designs their programs and services to be in alignment with the community that they serve respectively. So we're not like a franchise, if you will, where everybody has the same types of programming. What we do is based on our data-driven approach to designing our programs and services. We develop programs to meet the need of our community, and we look at what's happening in the landscape. So we have just around the corner from our facility a vocational education center. We partner with the Metropolitan Community Colleges. We are now in a process of partnering with the Kauffman Foundation, where there will be some
training. How many people are you actually producing that are in the IT field? Because I am so frustrated in going into offices and seeing people from other countries having these really good jobs, really good pay, and then walk out the front door and I see a bunch of black young guys just twiddling their thumbs or whatever, and nothing is really being done, it seems to me, to help them.
So you're absolutely right. There is a shortage of African Americans pursuing careers in the IT, especially in coding. And we are, as I was trying to finish saying, working collaboratively with the Kauffman Foundation and others to create opportunities to get black people into these training
How
programs.
successful is that?
We're just getting started. We're getting started. It takes time. And I feel your pain, and it's the reality of what it is, and we can only do so much with the resources that we have. And so thank you for your input.
Are you guys aware of Code KC?
I'm not sure. And I will talk to you about this offline if you don't mind, so we can allow an opportunity. I have
Okay,
another
thank
question.
you.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a little nervous, a little short too. I'll try to keep this brief, but I'll provide you with a little background. So about a week ago, a student at my school was bullied and sexually assaulted. And although it was a mild case of sexual assault, assault is still assault nonetheless. And I feel as if the punishment wasn't adequately put out. And I also don't want to see these kids just get suspended over this, because at the end of the day, like, what is that really teaching the kid, just to slap him with a 10-day suspension so he can sit home and be mad about doing what he already did? My proposal for a punishment for these kids was for them to have to write like a 5-page essay of the nuances of sexual assault. And I was wondering, you as a panel of women, like how, what punishments would you think would like fit in like cases like this of like sexual assault within school, and also of cases just of punishment in school in general that would like actually reach the child and actually learn them a lesson?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you as a student for being here tonight and for coming and lending your voice and for taking the time to ask a very important question. And I'm sorry that kids in your school and across this country are experiencing bullying and sexual assault. I think it's a serious offense. I will say that with discipline, what we're finding is that we need diverse perspectives, including students, to be at the table when we're talking about what punishment or consequences should look like. Also, to the gentleman that came 2 questions before you that talked about health, what we see in bully is that kids who often become bullies were bullied themselves in some aspect. And so when we think about consequences for a behavior that is not appropriate, we also need to have some humility and unpack and try to see if we can get to the cause of why people are committing the offenses that they are, but also have a consequence that is equitable to the offense. So I think for me and for women, and I can't speak for everyone, I feel heard, valued, included when an issue that is important to me and to populations that are proximate to me, when that is given the opportunity to have a rich dialogue and discussion. So for you, I think you have been able to stand in front of almost hundreds of people and voice this. I would say, how can we rally behind you to make this an issue that you can talk to the school board about, your principal or superintendent, and say, hey, I think that situations like this deserve some careful conversation and dialogue, and that we can all work together to create a policy or a program that will address this by saying there is no space for bullying and sexual assault, and if you are struggling, we can also get you help as well. So thank you for that. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'll make it quick because it seems like everyone's ready to leave. So I come from Grandview. I call it the come up city because, back then when I was growing up, it seemed that Grandview was, a little bit shameful, to be honest. But I come from Penn Valley. Actually, my class is all lined up over there. In class, we're talking about the broken window theory, how in society it seems that buildings with broken windows promote or breed crime, and kind of, there is no social pride in where they come from. And within the presentation, you talked about programs available to young people who are affected by violence. Now, are these programs allotted to outside the educational program? Because seeing that, as myself being a high school student and younger, I look up to the older adults. And adults are also affected by crime, you know, losing their loved ones and everything like that. So are these programs also allotted to outside the educational program? Or
So you're talking about the recommendation that I made?
Yeah.
About, oh,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so the recommendation actually is not, it is also inclusive of community-based organizations so that mental health supports can reside in the community as well as in schools. So yes, it would address youth and adults.
Okay.
Right, and so we several years ago operated a program where we had a mental health professional on the team at the Urban League, and so with communities of color, particularly African Americans, we tend to not want to pursue professional mental health supports. It's a stigma, a negative stigma. Right. So we embedded that service in the Urban League, and so that people could discreetly come in and see a licensed psychologist. And it proved to be very effective at having some interventions on a number of levels, substance abuse and everything. So yes, to your question, providing mental health is needed for adults as well as youth. But we really believe that if the earlier we start with that, that the better the outcomes will be long term.
And I kind of have a follow-up, sorry. Yes. And do you also think that maybe building the society around the educational program actually betters children within that school system? Like, I mean, we just had a Dairy Queen built. Yes. It was great. But, you know, making society better where the educational program, doesn't that promote more pride in where students come from and succeed in where they are?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion and debate in education and psychology about Ruby Payne's broken window theory and others, and that doesn't situate the problem of blight at the feet of the people in the community that are suffering. So one, when we think about investment in neighborhoods and communities, it is not only my responsibility as a person that lived there, but there's also other forms of government, maybe the city and others that are responsible for also thinking about how to maintain and how to address and how to build communities that are thriving, that have open spaces that are green and clean and all those good things. But to get to your point, you know, we often talk in education about what is the likelihood that we would have at scale quality schools in distressed communities. Because I'll tell you, as a parent, as an individual, when you have earned a degree or you got a job and you have money, you're thinking about where to live, and you want a community of promise, right? You want a community where you feel safe. You want a community where your kids can play. You want a community where there's amenities, where you can walk and play. And so when we have quality schools, as we should, in communities that are depressed, education can't solve all of societal ills. We are going to need partnerships to say, we know a quality school needs to happen in this neighborhood. We also need you to bring in commerce. We also need you to help find jobs. We also need transportation. We also need grocery stores. We also need quality housing, right? So some of the issues that are showing up to the issue that was raised about health and well-being, if you have folks that are in concentrated poverty in disinvested communities, riddled with crime, you know what we see in the research about the brain? We understand that the wiring of the brain does not develop as optimal as it should be. We understand that the amygdala, the part of your brain that has emotion, is normally oversized when you have post-traumatic stress or in constant states of stress. And your prefrontal cortex, which develops later, which are higher order thinking, your ability to pause, your ability to consciously think through consequences and outcomes that comes later in life, when it does come, it is in no way able to deal with the flood of emotions that are just straight up coming out making choices. So it's no rocket science to me that we have so much crime in areas of concentrated poverty because there lack opportunities and hope. So to all of this is to say, man, education gets hit a lot. And for some of it, they are rightfully so. We got to do better with schools and teachers and all that stuff. But some of the things that are showing up at our doorstep are not ours alone to deal with. And so we need a comprehensive, collective way to address some of these issues. And having students at the table showing up is one. So we want to encourage you to come.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Excellent, excellent, thank you. Okay, so so we are pretty much out of time. So the two people here, I know we got to be done. So we can take these last two. Let's start, this gentleman was first and then this young lady.
Just a quick question. So what's your recommendation for someone, I have a passion for mental health, and I really would like for kids who are experiencing mental health symptoms to not experience like punitive measures for their mental health, because I see it face like on the front line, a kid struggling with depression and anxiety is treated very severely wrong, and it seems like the schools don't have a lot of accommodations for that prefrontal cortex, the amygdala development, to institute mindfulness or other things in the classroom. How would you recommend someone like myself to kind of push the conversation with schools and school districts? I know they're doing like the trauma-sensitive training, but look, what is your recommendation? I think there should be some legislation around mental health in schools, but I really want to champion that. Just wondering what's your recommendation for someone who really is passionate about mental health, black men, and just black community getting healthier mentally, because I'm still foreign in that area.
So could you reach out? I mean, we can talk about getting you connected with some of the school leaders, and, you know, as we look at how we can activate the recommendation around getting more mental health supports. There's a health commission locally. We'll try to get you connected to that.
Thank you, Gwen.
Okay. Yes.
I attend a majority-minority student body, yet most of the teachers, there might be a total of 5 or 6 who are teachers of color. So I was wondering what is being done or what can be done to help grow those numbers into schools around the nation.
Did you have any research on that?
Oh my gosh, I'll talk about that. That's such a great question. There are efforts underway supported by some of our philanthropic entities in Kansas City that also understand the research about how it benefits you to see a teacher that looks like you, that understands you culturally, that comes from areas and neighborhoods that you come from, and how that relationship building leads to improvement in school outcomes. And so there's Latinx is one example of organization that receive philanthropic dollars to launch and start to promote having more Latino, Latina, Latinx teachers in the workplace. We also have other organizations that are looking at how do we increase representation of African Americans in the educational system, because when schools integrated back in 1950s, the kids integrated, but the teachers did not. Right? And so, and at the same time, we had a lot of other careers that were historically closed to African Americans start to open up, like nursing and legal fields. And so African American professionals had more disciplines to go into. And to be quite honest, hopefully there'll be some legislation around student loan debt, because if you graduate with $60,000, $70,000 of student loan debt, getting a job that pays you $29,000, $32,000 just doesn't add up for you. And so there are all these things that different groups are trying to work on to increase representation in schools. What we are, until we get to that point, one of the things that the recommendation is talking about in the Urban League book is culturally responsive, relevant, and culturally sustaining practices, so that if I'm coming in and teaching your school, there's a whole host of learning that I need to do to be able to serve you equitably in the right way, you know? So those are some things that we're working on.
So thank you. Thank you for your question. So, got to wrap this up. Yeah. So thanks to all of you. All of your questions were great. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate all of your joining us here tonight. So be on the lookout for a series of workshops, town hall meetings, and other forums to have an opportunity to join us and where we'll have more time to go into more depth on these subjects. And if you would like to have us bring a report to your group or your organization, reach out to the Urban League, and we'll try to schedule a road show just for you. Okay, so on your way out, you may pick up a copy of the book and read the recommendations and get busy, people. You can do something yourself personally to make a difference. So find that thing that you can do and be about doing it and stay engaged. Thank you so much for being here tonight.